In the winter of 1932, Harlem moved to a rhythm that only its people truly understood. The neighborhood breathed through the music pouring out of basement jazz clubs, through the quiet prayers whispered inside crowded churches, and through the determined footsteps of men and women who woke up every morning ready to fight a world that often refused to see their worth. Harlem was not perfect. It had its struggles, its arguments, its restless nights. But it also had something that the rest of New York City rarely understood: dignity. And in Harlem, dignity had a guardian. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was. Not the loudest man in the room, he never needed to be. Tall, composed, and thoughtful, he carried himself with a calm authority that made people listen long before he spoke. When he walked down Lenox Avenue, shop owners nodded respectfully, children greeted him with quiet curiosity, and elders acknowledged him with the kind of subtle respect reserved for someone who protected more than his own interests. To the outside world, Bumpy Johnson was simply another figure connected to Harlem's complicated underworld. But to the people who lived there, he represented something deeper, a man who understood that power meant responsibility. That winter evening, Harlem felt different. Snow had begun falling slowly across the city, covering rooftops and sidewalks in a soft white layer that reflected the glow of street lamps. Inside a small cafe on 135th Street, Bumpy sat at a corner table, sipping black coffee while quietly observing the room around him. The cafe was a gathering place for musicians, teachers, and workers who often ended their long days here, sharing stories about the world beyond Harlem's borders. But tonight, the conversations were quieter. People were watching the door. Not because they expected trouble, because trouble had already arrived in the city. Downtown Manhattan was buzzing with rumors about a powerful man who had decided Harlem needed new leadership. His name was Dutch Schultz, a man whose reputation was built not on patience or diplomacy, but on force. Schultz believed the city could be controlled if the right people were intimidated at the right time. For years he had watched Harlem from a distance, convinced that its influence could be absorbed into his expanding empire. To Schultz, Harlem was simply territory. But Harlem was never just territory, it was home. And Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. Across the city that same evening, Dutch Schultz sat in the back room of a restaurant that had long served as a meeting place for men who believed power came from dominance rather than respect. Schultz had spent years building alliances, expanding operations, and removing obstacles that stood between him and complete control of New York's underground economy. Yet Harlem remained outside his reach. Every time someone suggested pushing harder into the neighborhood, the same name surfaced: Bumpy Johnson. Schultz disliked the sound of it. He disliked it even more when people spoke the name with admiration rather than fear. "Tell me something," Schultz said slowly, leaning back in his chair while studying the men sitting across from him. "Why does everyone in Harlem act like this man is untouchable?" One of his associates cleared his throat carefully before answering. "It's not fear," the man explained. "It's respect." Schultz frowned. Respect was not something he believed in. Fear was reliable. Fear made people predictable. Respect, on the other hand, created loyalty, and loyalty was dangerous for someone trying to take control. Schultz drummed his fingers against the table. "Well," he said quietly, "maybe it's time someone reminded Harlem who runs this city." Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson finished his coffee and stepped outside into the cold night air. Snowflakes drifted gently past the streetlights as he walked slowly down the sidewalk, hands tucked inside the pockets of his overcoat. Harlem was quieter than usual, but Bumpy knew silence did not always mean peace. Sometimes silence meant people were waiting. A young man approached him cautiously near the corner. "Mr. Johnson," he said respectfully. Bumpy nodded. "What is it?" The young man glanced up and down the street before speaking. "There are strangers asking questions tonight." Bumpy's expression remained calm. "What kind of questions?" The young man hesitated. Questions about you. Bumpy nodded slightly, as if the information confirmed something he had already suspected. Thank you, he said. The young man walked away quickly, leaving Bumpy standing alone beneath the dim glow of the streetlight. He had spent years learning how to read situations before they unfolded. Trouble rarely arrived suddenly. It usually announced itself through whispers, rumors, and small movements that only attentive eyes could notice. And tonight, Harlem was whispering. Inside a nearby barbershop, several older men sat discussing the same rumors. Dutch Schultz. One of them muttered. Another shook his head slowly. That man doesn't understand Harlem. He will, the first man replied quietly. Because Harlem had something Schultz could never purchase. Unity. Later that night, Bumpy returned to his modest office above a bookstore on 138th Street. The room was simple but organized, with neatly stacked papers, a small desk lamp, and shelves filled with books that Bumpy often read during quiet evenings. Unlike many men involved in the city's darker dealings, Bumpy valued knowledge as much as influence. He believed understanding people was the only way to truly lead them. A knock sounded at the door. Bumpy looked up. Come in. Two trusted friends entered the room, both carrying expressions that suggested they had important news. They're moving, one of them said. Bumpy leaned back slightly in his chair. How many? Hard to say, the other replied. But people downtown are saying Schultz is serious this time. Bumpy remained quiet for a moment. Serious men usually send messages before they act, he said. And Schultz? Bumpy smiled faintly. Schultz prefers dramatic entrances. Outside, snow continued falling across Harlem streets. But beneath that quiet blanket of winter, tension was spreading through the neighborhood. People sensed something approaching, something dangerous. And yet, inside his office, Bumpy Johnson remained calm. He stood slowly and walked toward the window, looking out at the silent street below. Harlem's lights glowed warmly in the distance, reflecting off the snow-covered sidewalks. Do you know why Harlem survives? Bumpy asked quietly. The two men exchanged confused glances. Why? Bumpy folded his hands behind his back. Because people here understand something the rest of the city forgets. He paused before continuing. Strength doesn't come from violence. He turned toward them. It comes from dignity. The men nodded slowly, though they were not entirely sure what Bumpy intended to do. But they trusted him. Because Bumpy Johnson never rushed into chaos. He waited, he listened. And when the moment arrived, he acted with quiet certainty. Across the river, Dutch Schultz finished his drink and stood up from the table. Enough waiting, he said. The men around him looked up. Schultz adjusted his coat. I want 12 men ready tonight. No one asked why. They already understood. Because in Schultz's world, problems were solved quickly. And Harlem was about to become one. But what Schultz didn't understand, what he would soon learn the hard way, was that Harlem didn't respond to intimidation the way other neighborhoods did. Harlem had Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy Johnson believed that sometimes the most powerful weapon a man could use was not violence, it was restraint. The kind of restraint that could stop a war before it even began. Outside, the snow kept falling. And somewhere in the distance, 12 men were preparing to walk into Harlem. What they didn't realize was that by the time they arrived, the entire neighborhood would already know they were coming. And waiting, because Harlem protected its own. And the night that Dutch Schultz decided to challenge that truth would become a story the city would never forget. Sometimes the quietest man in the room carries the strongest voice. By the time the snow stopped falling over Harlem, the city had already begun whispering about the men who were coming. Harlem was the kind of place where information moved quietly but quickly, carried through barbershops, church steps, cafe tables, and street corners where people stood longer than necessary just to watch who passed by. No formal alarm was ever raised, no bells rang. Yet somehow the neighborhood understood that strangers were moving through the city with a purpose that had nothing to do with music or business or community. 12 men had been sent north from downtown Manhattan, and even before their cars crossed into Harlem, people already sensed that something heavy was approaching Dot inside his modest office above the bookstore on 138th Street. Bumpy Johnson remained seated at his desk, turning the pages of a small book he had been reading earlier that evening. To anyone looking in from the outside, he would have appeared completely undisturbed, a man passing the late hours of the night in quiet reflection. But Bumpy Johnson did not read books merely to pass time. He read to sharpen his mind, to slow his thoughts, and to keep his instincts clear in moments when other men might panic. Tonight was exactly the kind of moment where panic would serve no purpose. Across Harlem, a young boy ran into a small grocery store on Lenox Avenue where the owner stood counting coins behind the counter. "They're here," the boy said breathlessly. The shop owner looked up calmly. "How many?" "2 cars," the boy replied. "Black ones, just crossed 125th. The shop owner nodded slowly and continued counting the coins in his hand. After a moment, he placed them carefully into the drawer and closed the register. "Go home," he told the boy gently. The boy hesitated. "Is something going to happen?" The shop owner looked out through the front window at the quiet street. "No," he said softly. "Something is going to be decided." Further down the avenue, in a dimly lit jazz club where a pianist played slow blues to a nearly empty room, the bartender wiped a glass while watching the door. 2 unfamiliar men had entered earlier, asking casual questions about where Bumpy Johnson spent his evenings. They had spoken politely, but the bartender recognized the stiffness in their posture and the careful way they scanned the room. When they left, the bartender turned to the pianist. "Word's going around," he sighed quietly. The pianist nodded without stopping his music. "Harlem already knows." Meanwhile, the 2 black cars continued their slow journey north through the city streets. Inside them sat 12 men who believed they had been chosen for a simple task. Dutch Schultz had not given long speeches or complicated instructions. Schultz was not a man who wasted time on philosophy. He had simply said, "End the problem." And to the men riding in those cars, the problem had a name: Bumpy Johnson. The first car turned onto Lenox Avenue, its tires crunching softly against the snow that still covered the pavement. The driver slowed slightly, scanning the neighborhood. Harlem looked peaceful. Lights glowed warmly in apartment windows. A few people walked along the sidewalks wrapped in coats against the winter cold. Nothing looked threatening. But something felt unusual. The streets were too calm. The driver leaned slightly toward the passenger beside him. "You notice something?" he muttered. The passenger looked out the window. "Yeah. What is it?" The passenger frowned. "They're watching us." The driver glanced toward the sidewalks again. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he realized what his partner meant. People were watching. Not openly, not aggressively, but quietly. An old man leaning on a cane near a doorway. 2 women standing near a corner store. A newspaper vendor pretending to organize his stack of papers. None of them spoke. None of them reacted. They simply observed. The car continued moving. In the second vehicle behind them, another man lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "This place gives me a strange feeling," he said. His partner shrugged. "It's just another neighborhood." But deep down he knew it wasn't, because most neighborhoods reacted with fear when men like them arrived. Harlem did not. Harlem simply watched. Inside the office above the bookstore, Bumpy Johnson finally closed his book and placed it gently on the desk. 2 of his closest allies sat across from him, their expressions more tense than his own. "They're close," one of them said quietly. Bumpy nodded. "I know. You want us to call more people?" Bumpy leaned back slightly in his chair. No. The two men exchanged uneasy looks. Bumpy, one of them said carefully. If Schultz really sent men. Bumpy raised his hand slightly, and the room fell silent. Listen, he said calmly. They listened. For a moment, there was only the faint sound of wind brushing against the building outside. Then, in the distance, the low rumble of a car engine echoed faintly through the street below. Bumpy stood slowly and walked toward the window. They're here, he said quietly. Down on the street, the two cars finally stopped. The 12 men stepped out. They were dressed neatly, their coats pulled tight against the cold. Each one moved with quiet confidence. They had performed tasks like this before. They believed. They understood how the night would end. They did not understand Harlem. The moment their feet touched the sidewalk, they felt the weight of unseen eyes surrounding them. A man sweeping snow from the entrance of a nearby building paused briefly to watch them. Across the street, a woman pulling her coat tighter slowed her walk slightly. A taxi driver parked near the curb leaned casually against his car. None of them spoke, but all of them noticed. The 12 men approached the building where Bumpy's office was located. Inside, Bumpy turned away from the window. Well, he said quietly, no reason to keep them waiting. His friends stared at him in disbelief. You're not serious, Bumpy smiled faintly. Very. He walked toward the door calmly. What are you going to do? One of them asked. Bumpy paused before answering. I'm going to talk. Outside, the 12 men entered the building. The hallway was dimly lit, the wooden floor creaking slightly beneath their boots. They moved carefully, listening for any sound that might suggest resistance. But the building remained silent. Too silent. One of the men gestured toward the staircase. They began climbing. Upstairs, Bumpy stood calmly beside the door to his office. The footsteps grew louder, closer. One of his friends whispered urgently. Bumpy, this is madness. Bumpy simply straightened his coat. Sometimes, he said quietly, people need to be reminded that dignity is stronger than fear. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A hand pushed it open. The 12 men entered and stopped. Because Bumpy Johnson was standing there waiting for them. Not hiding, not frightened, just waiting. The room filled with heavy silence. One of the men stepped forward cautiously. You Bumpy Johnson? Bumpy nodded politely. I am. The man glanced around the room, clearly surprised by the lack of armed guards or visible protection. That's it, he muttered. Bumpy tilted his head slightly. That's what. The man gestured around the room, no defense. Bumpy looked at him calmly. You're in Harlem, the man frowned. So? Bumpy stepped closer, his voice quiet but steady. In Harlem, he said gently, people solve problems differently. The 12 men looked at each other uneasily. Something about this situation felt wrong. Nothing was happening the way they expected. Bumpy studied them carefully before speaking again. 12 men, he said thoughtfully. The leader crossed his arms. And? Bumpy nodded slowly. That means someone important sent you. No one spoke. But the silence confirmed what Bumpy already knew. Dutch Schultz, he said. The leader's jaw tightened slightly. You talk too much. Bumpy smiled faintly. Not really. He stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. Just listen well. The room remained completely silent. Outside, Harlem waited. Inside, 12 men stood face to face with the one man they had been sent to eliminate. But something unexpected was happening. The tension that should have exploded into violence was dissolving into uncertainty. Because Bumpy Johnson was not behaving like a man facing 12 enemies. He was behaving like a man welcoming guests. And that confused them more than any weapon ever could. Bumpy folded his hands calmly. Gentlemen, he said quietly, before anyone makes a mistake tonight, I suggest we have a conversation. The leader stared at him. A conversation? Bumpy nodded, yes. He gestured toward the chairs in the room. Because the decision you make in the next few minutes will determine whether Harlem sleeps peacefully tonight. He paused. Or remembers this night forever. The room went completely still. And for the first time since leaving downtown Manhattan, the 12 men began to realize something unsettling. They had walked into Harlem believing they were in control. But the calm man standing in front of them had already changed the entire situation without raising his voice. And none of them yet understood how powerful that could be. Outside, the streetlights flickered softly over the quiet snow-covered sidewalks. Harlem remained silent, waiting. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in a story is not the confrontation itself, it is the breath taken just before everything changes. For several seconds after Bumpy Johnson invited the 12 men to sit, no one moved. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the air understood that something delicate was unfolding in that quiet office above the bookstore. Outside, Harlem remained still beneath the streetlights, the snow reflecting a soft glow across the sidewalks. The city beyond the neighborhood continued its restless movement, unaware that a decision was slowly forming in a small room where 12 strangers had come expecting violence, but instead found themselves standing inside something far more unsettling calm. The leader of the group studied Bumpy carefully, trying to understand the man in front of him. He had been told many things about Bumpy Johnson before arriving in Harlem. Some said Bumpy was clever. Others said he was dangerous. A few said he was unpredictable. But no one had said he would be calm in a moment like this. No one had said he would invite 12 men sent to harm him into a conversation, as if they were visitors stopping by for coffee. One of the men shifted his weight uneasily. "You're not scared?" he asked. Bumpy looked at him for a moment before answering. "No," he said simply. The man frowned. 12 men walk into your office in the middle of the night and you're not worried?" Bumpy smiled slightly, though the smile carried no arrogance. "Worry doesn't solve problems," he replied quietly. The leader glanced around the room again. The men sitting with Bumpy were not armed guards, and their expressions were tense but controlled. None of them had made a sudden move. None had reached for anything that might escalate the situation. It felt almost unnatural. "You're either very brave," the leader said slowly, "or very foolish." Bumpy folded his hands behind his back. "Sometimes," he said calmly, "those two things look the same." The men standing near the doorway exchanged uncertain glances. They had entered the building expecting a confrontation. They expected shouting, threats, or an attempt to escape. Instead, they had walked into a quiet conversation where the man they were sent to eliminate spoke as if they were simply part of a late-night discussion about philosophy. Outside on the street below, the taxi driver who had parked near the corner remained inside his car, watching the building with quiet patience. He had lived in Harlem long enough to recognize when the neighborhood was holding its breath. A few blocks away, lights still glowed inside a church where several elders had gathered after hearing whispers about strangers arriving from downtown. No one panicked. Harlem had learned long ago that panic was exactly what men like Dutch Schultz hoped to create. Inside the office, Bumpy walked slowly toward the small table where several chairs were arranged. He pulled one out and sat down. The 12 men remained standing. Bumpy looked up at them. "Gentlemen," he said gently, "you've traveled a long way tonight. Standing the entire time won't help any of us think clearly." The leader hesitated before finally pulling out a chair and sitting down across from him. His men followed cautiously, though several remained near the door, unsure whether sitting would somehow make them vulnerable. The leader leaned forward slightly. "You know why we're here?" Bumpy nodded. "Yes. Then why are we talking?" Bumpy studied him for a moment. "Because sometimes men are sent to do things they don't fully understand." The leader's eyes narrowed. "And you think we don't understand?" Bumpy shook his head slowly. I think you understand the order. He paused, but not the consequences. The room fell silent again. One of the younger men spoke up suddenly. Look, he said impatiently, we didn't come here for speeches. Bumpy turned toward him calmly. No, he agreed. You came here for a decision, the young man frowned. What decision? Bumpy leaned back slightly in his chair. The decision between pride and wisdom. Several of the men exchanged puzzled looks. The leader spoke again. You talk like this is some kind of lesson. Bumpy's voice remained steady. Maybe it is. He looked around the room, meeting each man's eyes one by one. Tell me something, he continued. Did Dutch Schultz explain Harlem to you? No one answered. Did he explain who lives here? Silence. Did he explain why this neighborhood stands together even when the rest of the city ignores it? The men remained quiet. Bumpy nodded slowly. That's what I thought. He stood and walked slowly toward the window overlooking the street. Harlem has seen many men come here believing they could control it, he said quietly. Men with money, men with power, men with influence. He looked out at the quiet street below. And every time they learned the same lesson. The leader folded his arms. And what lesson is that? Bumpy turned back toward them. That Harlem belongs to the people who protect it. His words hung in the air. One of the men near the door finally spoke. So you're saying we should just leave? Bumpy walked back toward the table. I'm saying tonight doesn't have to become something none of us can take back. The leader leaned forward again. You think we're afraid? Bumpy shook his head. No. Then why should we walk away? Bumpy's answer came slowly. Because fear isn't the only thing that guides a man. He looked directly at the leader. Sometimes understanding is stronger. The room remained quiet. For the first time since entering the building, the men began noticing details they had ignored earlier. The calm tone of Bumpy's voice. The steady way he held eye contact. The fact that no one in the room had treated them with hatred or threats. It was unsettling. The leader rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You're an interesting man, Bumpy. Johnson. Bumpy nodded politely. I've been called worse. The leader leaned back slightly in his chair. Let's say we leave tonight, he said slowly. What happens tomorrow? Bumpy didn't hesitate. Tomorrow Harlem wakes up the same way it always does. And Schultz? Bumpy smiled faintly. That depends on the message you bring him. The leader stared at him. You want us to carry a message? Bumpy shrugged slightly. You came here to deliver one. He paused. It seems fair that you take one back. The room went silent again. Outside, the taxi driver noticed movement in a nearby window and leaned forward slightly, trying to see what was happening inside the building. Inside the office, the leader stood up slowly. The other men followed. For a moment it seemed like the tension might finally break. But instead, the leader extended his hand. Bumpy looked at it briefly before shaking it. The leader spoke quietly. You know something? Bumpy raised an eyebrow. What's that? The leader exhaled slowly. You're the first man I've met who could stop 12 men with nothing but words. Bumpy released his hand. Words can be powerful, he said softly. The leader turned toward the door. His men followed. One by one they stepped into the hallway, all except one. A man who had remained quiet the entire night stayed near the doorway, watching Bumpy carefully. You're not what we expected, he said quietly. Bumpy smiled slightly. That seems to be happening a lot tonight. The man nodded slowly. I'm the one who reports back to Schultz. Bumpy stepped closer. Then you should listen carefully. The man leaned forward slightly. Bumpy spoke calmly. Tell Dutch Schultz something simple. The man waited. Bumpy's voice remained steady. Tell him Harlem doesn't answer to fear. He paused briefly. It answers to respect. The man nodded slowly. Then he turned and walked down. The hallway. Moments later, the building door closed softly as the 12 men disappeared back into the snowy Harlem street. Inside the office, Bumpy returned to the window. The two cars started their engines. Then they drove away. One of Bumpy's friends exhaled deeply. I thought tonight was going to end very differently. Bumpy looked down at the quiet street. So did they. The snow began falling again, soft, silent. Harlem slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But somewhere downtown, a powerful man named Dutch Schultz was about to receive a message carried by the only man who had remained behind. And that message would change everything. Because sometimes the most powerful victory is not the one that ends a fight. It is the one that prevents it. Long before sunrise reached Harlem, the city had already begun moving again. Street sweepers pushed thin layers of snow aside. Cafe owners unlocked their doors, and the quiet rhythm of early morning returned to the neighborhood. To anyone passing through, it appeared to be an ordinary winter morning in New York. But beneath that calm surface, Harlem carried the memory of the previous night like a quiet secret shared by everyone who had witnessed even a small part of it. No one had heard gunfire. No one had seen chaos. Yet something powerful had happened. Inside the modest office above the bookstore, Bumpy Johnson remained awake long after the 12 men had left. He stood beside the same window where he had watched their cars disappear into the snowy darkness hours earlier. The city lights were fading now as the sky slowly turned pale gray with the approaching dawn. Bumpy had always believed that moments like this, when the night ended, and the Bumpy had always believed at moments like this, world began again, were when a man could truly understand the consequences of his decisions. Behind him, two of his trusted friends sat quietly, exhaustion visible on their faces. "You think Schultz will understand the message?" one of them asked. Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He watched a group of early workers walking along Lenox Avenue, their coats pulled tight against the cold. These were the people who mattered most to him. Men and women who woke every day determined to live with dignity in a city that often treated them unfairly. Finally, Bumpy spoke. "Understanding is a choice," he said quietly. His friend frowned. "You think Schultz will choose it?" Bumpy turned away from the window and smiled slightly. "That depends on how much he values peace." Across the river in downtown Manhattan, the man who would soon receive the message had spent the entire night waiting. Dutch Schultz hated uncertainty. He had built his reputation on control, and control meant knowing how situations would end before they even began. That was why he had sent 12 men instead of 2 or 3. He believed overwhelming force removed doubt from the equation. Yet as the night passed and morning approached, something unusual was happening. The men had not returned. Schultz sat at the same table where he had given the order hours earlier, tapping his fingers against the polished wood surface. The room smelled of smoke and expensive liquor, but the atmosphere was tense. One of his associates tried to reassure him. "They'll finish the job," the man said. Schultz didn't respond. Instead, he glanced toward the door. Because for the first time in a long while, he was beginning to wonder whether the situation had unfolded the way he expected. Outside, a car finally stopped near the building. Moments later, footsteps echoed through the hallway. The door opened. One man walked in. Just one. Schultz looked up slowly. His eyes moved past the man, as if expecting others to appear behind him. No one did. The room fell silent. Schultz leaned back in his chair. "Where are the others?" he asked. The man removed his coat slowly before answering. "They went home." Schultz frowned. "Home?" The man nodded. "Yes." The room grew colder. Schultz leaned forward. "You're telling me 12 men walked into Harlem and only one came back here?" The man met his gaze calmly. "That's correct." Schultz's voice hardened. "What happened?" For several seconds, the man said nothing. Then he spoke. We met Bumpy Johnson. Schultz laughed softly. I know you met him, he said impatiently. That was the whole point. The man shook his head slightly. No, Schultz's expression darkened. You don't understand. The man took a slow breath. No, he said quietly. I think you're the one who doesn't. The tension in the room grew heavier. Schultz leaned forward again. Explain. The man stepped closer to the table. He was waiting for us. Schultz frowned. So what? He didn't hide. Schultz shrugged. That just means he's brave. The man shook his head again. It wasn't bravery. Schultz's patience was fading. Then what was it? The man looked directly at him. It was control. The room went silent. Schultz tapped his fingers slowly against the table. 12 men, he said. Yes, and none of you did anything? The man answered calmly. No. Schultz stared at him as if trying to determine whether he was being mocked. You expect me to believe that? The man stepped even closer. He stopped 12 men without raising his voice. Schultz scoffed. That's impossible. The man shook his head. No. He paused. It isn't. Schultz leaned back again, studying him carefully. What did he say? The man exhaled slowly. He said Harlem doesn't answer to fear. Schultz's eyes narrowed. And? The man continued. He said it answers to respect. The room remained silent. Schultz stared at the table, thinking. For the first time since building his empire, he was hearing a report that did not include violence or intimidation or victory through force. Instead, he was hearing something else, restraint. Schultz looked up again. You walked away because of words? The man nodded. Yes. Schultz shook his head slowly. That's not how this city works. The man met his gaze. It might be how Harlem works. Schultz remained quiet for several seconds. Then he asked one final question. What else did he say? The man's voice softened slightly. He said the choice we made tonight would determine whether Harlem slept peacefully or remembered the night forever. The room fell completely. Schultz leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Finally he laughed, not loudly, but thoughtfully. Well, he said slowly, that's an interesting man. The men in the room waited for his next words carefully. Schultz stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Snow still covered the streets below. New York looked peaceful. He spoke without turning around. Leave Harlem alone. The men exchanged surprised looks. Schultz continued. Some places aren't worth the trouble. Back in Harlem, the morning sun finally broke through the winter clouds. The neighborhood slowly returned to life. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Children walked to school. Music drifted once again from basement clubs where musicians prepared for another night of jazz. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of the day, something had changed. Word traveled quietly through the streets. Dutch Schultz had sent 12 men to Harlem, and none of them had harmed Bumpy Johnson. Inside the small cafe on 135th Street, where Bumpy had been sitting the previous evening, several people gathered around a table discussing the rumors. Is it true? Someone asked. The cafe owner nodded slowly. Yes, another man leaned forward. What happened? The owner smiled faintly. Bumpy talked. The table fell silent. Outside, Bumpy Johnson walked calmly down Lenox Avenue, greeting neighbors the same way he always had. Nothing about his appearance suggested that anything extraordinary had happened during the night, because to Bumpy, the outcome had never been extraordinary. It had simply been the result of something he believed deeply, that dignity was stronger than intimidation, that patience could defeat anger, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a man could do was refuse to fight. As he reached the corner of 138th Street, a young boy who had been playing nearby looked up at him with curiosity. Mr. Johnson, the boy asked, is it true 12 men came to see you last night? Bumpy smiled gently. Yes. The boy's eyes widened. Were you scared? Bumpy thought for a moment before answering. No, the boy tilted his head. Why not? Bumpy placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Because sometimes the strongest weapon a man can carry isn't a gun or a fist. The boy looked confused. What is it then? Bumpy smiled again. Character. He continued walking down the street as the morning sun lit Harlem with warm golden light. Behind him, the neighborhood carried on with its daily life, peaceful, dignified, and proud. Because on a quiet winter night, 12 men had come looking for violence. But they had found something far stronger, respect. And sometimes respect is the one message that even the most powerful men cannot ignore.